Sci-fi is a genre I had never really considered myself a fan of. I don't dislike it. I guess I just felt like the common aesthetics and ideas explored just weren't really my thing. In spite of all that though, I've really enjoyed a lot of the sci-fi stories I've experienced in recent years. The most notable in this case would be The Somnium Files. Maybe you'd say it like AI The Somnium Files instead? I have no idea. Was quite an influential game for me. Not only did it make me want to check out more visual novels, I was also inspired to make my first video about the game. Though that video is bad, please don't watch it. At the same time, I am glad I made that video though. It was a great learning experience and I'm proud of the work I put into it, even if I'm not super satisfied with the end result. One of the many mistakes I feel like I made with that video is not mentioning the game's director, Kotaro Uchikoshi. Uchikoshi is an interesting fellow. One of the things I really like about his games is that you can always recognise his directorial style. His heavy use of mysteries and misdirection, combined with the confident way in which his stories are presented, makes for a director with a very distinct creative voice. You never really know what you might get with his games, especially since he pretty much never rests on his laurels, always looking to do something new with each of his games. Oh, and also the guy's kinda a nutcase in the best way possible. Naturally, as a big fan of I wanted to go check out the other games he worked on beforehand, and so the Zero Escape series quickly made its way onto my radar, being his most notable. Zero Escape is a trilogy centered around characters being kidnapped by a mysterious mastermind named Zero who forces them to play deadly games. The basic premise sounds simple enough. It doesn't even sound like a sci-fi story on the surface, but the sci-fi elements are where the depth of the series comes from, and believe me, it goes deep. First up, a basic summary of the series is in order. I don't normally like to just dump information like this in a summary, but I think it's kinda necessary here since Zero Escape is so complex. Though if you're already familiar with the series, you can just skip here. The first entry is 9 hours, 9 persons, 9 doors, or simply just 999. 999 centers around Junpei, a college student who is among 9 people who were kidnapped and forced to play the Nonary game, a game where they put their lives on the line. Their captor goes by the name Zero, a masked figure whose identity and motives are completely unknown. The most noteworthy player in the game besides Junpei himself is Akane Kurashiki, Junpei's childhood friend who he hasn't met in years. At the end of the game, Junpei learns the purpose of the Nonary game. 9 years ago, another Nonary game took place. It was an experiment to have children access the morphogenetic field. To keep the explanations short, it's essentially an experiment to awaken telepathic abilities in the children. Because of this, the people with the ability to access the field are referred to as Espers. Among the kidnapped children was Akane, who ended up dying in the Nonary game, though her fate technically isn't decided until the Nonary game in the present day, allowing her to continue living in a paradoxical state where she's neither alive or dead. What determines her fate is the actions that Junpei takes in the present day. He's connected to the young Akane through the morphogenetic field, and it's revealed that the player is actually playing as the young Akane, seeing into the present through Junpei's eyes and influencing the decisions that he takes without him realizing, all in an attempt to guide him to a situation where both of them can be saved. Zero's true identity is actually Akane's older self that's seen in the present. She created the future she saw through Junpei's eyes in the past in order to be saved. In the end, Akane's life is saved, and Junpei is able to escape the Nonary game alive along with everyone else. Akane and her brother Aoi go into hiding after the Nonary game, and Junpei vows to find her. Next up is Virtue's Last Reward, or VLR for short. Near the end of 2028, a year after 999's events, another Nonary game takes place, where once again 9 people are kidnapped. The Nonary game in VLR centers around a minigame played during it known as the Ambidex game. The AB game is closely based on the prisoner's dilemma, where you have a choice of either allying with or betraying your opponent, where betrayal is guaranteed to keep you safe, unlike allying. But if both parties ally, it's the best overall result for everyone. The main character of VLR is Sigma. Yes, please get all your Sigma mail jokes out of the way. Sigma discovers that he seems to be transferring his consciousness across timelines, as is another important character, Phi. By exploring all of the different timelines and collecting vital information, Sigma and Phi are able to reach a timeline where everyone is able to escape safely, minus the game's antagonist, Dio. It's then that they're told the truth by Tenmyoji, the oldest person taking part in this nonary game. They're actually on the moon. The red moon they see in the sky is actually the Earth. Its red appearance was caused by the detonation of every single annihilation reactor on the planet, sending huge amounts of dust particles into the atmosphere. A total of 6 billion people, 75% of humanity, were killed in these explosions. The reason this all happened is because of a deadly virus known as Radical 6 that was released at the end of 2028 by a religious organisation known as Free the Soul. The virus causes patients to develop an overwhelming urge to commit suicide, which ended up bringing humanity to its knees. In April 2029, the reactors were detonated in an attempt to purge the virus, though in all likelihood it was probably just an attempt at mass suicide by the infected. And only a quarter of the population was left afterwards. Tenmyoji is one of these survivors, and is actually someone you'd know very well from 999. His name is Junpei Tenmyoji, the former game's protagonist. And as his much older appearance implies, the actual year that VLR takes place in is much later than you're initially led to believe. The year is actually 2074. So, what's the purpose of the nonary game then? Well, it was once again organised by someone calling himself Zero, and Zero also had help from Akane. The goal of this nonary game was to develop Sigma and Vi's ability to jump across timelines. As such, everyone was made to play the AB game in order to create a lot of different choices that would split off into numerous timelines for the pair to jump between. Once their ability is fully honed, the goal is to have Sigma and Vi jump back to 2028 and prevent Radical 6 from ever being released. In truth, Zero in this game is actually Sigma's older self, and Sigma now finds himself in his 68-year-old body, as his consciousness was transferred into it in the moment he was knocked out and kidnapped in 2028. Because of this, his older self's consciousness is in his young body back in 2028 before the new year, and Vi is about to join him, while the younger Sigma is sent to the day the reactors are detonated in the event that the attempt to stop Radical 6 fails, where he'll then spend the next 45 years developing the nonary game on the moon in order to try again. Finally, there's Zero Time Dilemma, or ZTD. Yes, I say Z the American way. I'm not really sure why, but saying Z just feels wrong to me. ZTD takes place in Nevada on New Year's Eve 2028, the day that Radical 6 is released. 8 people are kidnapped from a simulated Mars base nearby. Among them are some familiar faces. Well, I'd say familiar, but the character designer for the game is different, so would you even know that this is Junpei or this is Akane if I didn't tell you? Anyway, they're all trapped alongside a child they don't recognise in a shelter where everyone is forced to play the decision game, a game where the way out will only be opened after at least 6 people have died. ZTD connects to VLR with an ending that leads directly into it, where Radical 6 is released from the shelter, but it also connects to a new future, where the pandemic is prevented entirely. The decision game has multiple purposes, all relating to its mastermind. The Zero in this game is a 124-year-old man named Delta, also known as Brother, founder of Free the Soul. Delta is the son of Sigma and Diana, 2 of the players in the decision game, and Vi's twin brother. The purpose of the decision game was to ensure that their birth happens in at least one timeline. Oh god, they're hideous. The next purpose was to release Radical 6. His goal in releasing it was to kill 75% of humanity, giving him a 75% chance of killing a religious terrorist that, according to him, will go on to cause a nuclear war that will kill all of humanity. The final purpose of the decision game is to create a timeline where everyone escapes the game alive. Because Radical 6 isn't released in this timeline, the religious terrorist will go on to destroy humanity. Delta's goal in this timeline is to inspire a will for change in the 9 players, which will get them to stop the religious terrorist without the need for Radical 6. Right as the game ends, Delta gives Carlos the choice of whether to kill him or not, and Carlos's decision is left ambiguous.
The fates of you, me, and mankind are all on the line. This is the decision game.
This may not be a perfect summary of the trilogy. I did have to leave out a lot of details, and these games are pretty heavy on information, but if there's something important I've not brought up in my summary, I'll cover it if and when it's relevant. This was mainly just to establish the broad strokes if you're unfamiliar with the series or perhaps need a refresher on how things play out. In that summary, you'll probably notice that there was a pretty huge shift in the series' scope going from the first entry to the second. You go from a story about saving one person to a story about saving humanity from an apocalyptic virus, and I can't really say the transition was done 100% smoothly with how sudden it was. I, for one, really wasn't sure what to make of it at first when I initially completed VLR, and I honestly wouldn't blame anyone if they were kind of put off by VLR changing things in such a huge way. That said, I do still think that for the most part, VLR and ZTD were able to pull off such a huge raising of the stakes by maintaining many of the elements first established in 999, making the series still feel largely cohesive. 999 is the game that really carved out the series' identity, which its two successors maintained and largely didn't deviate from. 999 is a game with a lot of very obvious love for the sci-fi genre. You'll often see characters discussing famous scientific and philosophical thought experiments. And the stories are no strangers to all sorts of concepts that are staples in the genre, such as time travel and, along with it, bootstrap paradoxes, which are especially prevalent in Zero Escape. The use of these elements help VLR feel like it still takes place in the same world as 999, even if said world has been through an apocalypse since the last game. It definitely also helps that VLR doesn't show its hand immediately. All the stuff you learn about Radical 6 and the 45-year jump in time is presented to you gradually over the entire game, in a way that's not super explicit too, so it lets you put the pieces together rather than having the change in status quo just dumped on you all at once. The question is whether such a big increase in stakes was worth it. I can't really give a definitive answer on that. It's not hard to imagine that some would feel alienated by it if they preferred the smaller scope of 999. But if you want my opinion, I think they made it work, even if it is kinda jarring at first. Before starting VLR, my main question was how you'd actually continue the series after how conclusive the first game was. And the whole Radical 6 Apocalypse plot point gave the series a new direction to follow, which I think was more interesting than if we just got more stories about small individual nonary games. At the same time though, there are definitely some issues with the new direction, and I feel like ZTD is the game which really showcases a lot of these issues. I suppose the way I'd sum it up would be that the game goes a little too far in places with certain decisions. Zero Time Dilemma runs into an issue in creating larger stories like this, where the added complexity leads to a very over-connected story in places. The prime example of this is Delta and Phi being the children of Sigma and Diana. VLR sets up the mystery of Phi's unknown parents, and then the truth just isn't satisfying. I think Phi being Sigma's daughter is by far my least favourite thing about ZTD. Not only does it make some scenes in VLR very uncomfortable with hindsight, but also what does this actually add to the overall story or Phi as a character? Adding to that, and this is kind of a tangent here, but am I the only one who thinks Phi does almost nothing in this game? The most important things she does are burning to death, which leads to her birth. Yeah, it's weird. And getting pricked with a needle, which causes VLR to happen. Both of those are just passive things that happen to her. She never actually affects the story in any meaningful way through her own agency, which is just weird. They build her up as one of the most important characters in VLR, only for her to do next to nothing in ZTD. In fact, it feels like she's just dead for most of the late game scenes, and so you don't even get to see her reaction to a lot of the big reveals. I know Zero Escape isn't really a series that's too focused on characters, but building up a character as an important figure only for them to just not be is questionable. To end off this little tangent, I'm talking about shipping, I guess. Why? Well, to be honest, it's because I find the concept of Zero Escape shipping quite funny, to be honest. It just doesn't seem like the kind of series where that should really be at the forefront of people's thinking. Sure, there are explicit romantic pairings in the series, but for the most part I don't exactly feel like these kinds of evil murder games lend themselves well to shipping. Oh yeah, so who do you guys ship? So anyway, yeah, basically, it seems like some people shipped Sigma and Phi back when VLR came out, and after ZTD, all I can say is that if you shipped them, my condolences. And if you still ship them,
you go to hell before you die.
Anyway, back to the actual point. Another example of things all feeling too connected is the snail. So basically, years ago in the series storyline, a snail ended up causing a woman to get murdered, which resulted in the deaths of 5 others. Why is this important? Well, two of the people who died were Akane's parents, leading to her and her brother living alone, and as such they were easy to kidnap, which led to them being forced to play the Nonary game, leading to Akane accessing her abilities as an Esper, which essentially causes all of Zero Escape to happen. I imagine the intention for it was to be a nod to the butterfly effect, as well as tying into Delta's repeated assertion.
Sometimes, life is simply unfair.
But reducing everything to one single inciting event is definitely a bit off-putting and just makes the story feel smaller in my opinion. The last thing is that ZTD just does some weird stuff with the world of the series, namely with its introduction of the Transporter. The Transporter is a device which copies objects perfectly and sends those copies to wherever the Transporter is located in another timeline while the original object remains. This is how Delta and Phi are able to exist in every timeline despite only being born in one. They got transported into the early 1900s, Delta remained there while a copy of Phi was transported into the 21st century. The real issue here is that it's apparently an alien device, according to Delta. Sure, that kind of thing isn't exactly outlandish territory for sci-fi, but Zero Escape was never a series that ventured into that territory, and so it just feels really strange and out of place, especially since it's hardly elaborated upon at all. Still, for all these issues I have with it, I want to make it clear that I don't hate the game. Honestly, I feel like my list of gripes about it is much shorter than a lot of people's.
Don't worry, I won't die. Even if this body is destroyed, my consciousness will be... No! Carlos!
Overall, I'd say that aside from a few issues, the new direction the series took was absolutely worth it. In my eyes, the strengths eclipse the weaknesses. Perhaps the greatest of those strengths is the use of plot twists. Just ignore that one. Twists are a core part of Zero Escape's identity, and through plenty of interesting and unconventional means, they remain consistently surprising. My favourite twists are always the ones involving Zero's identity. The trilogy essentially does the same twist 3 times in a row, and somehow it's still surprising every single time, which I find really impressive. In these games where every character is potentially untrustworthy, the last person you expect to be Zero is the player character, and yet it's the case in all 3 games. The reveal that you're not actually playing as Junpei in 999 and instead are just seeing through his eyes is so masterfully executed. Though it was kind of ruined for me since I played the remaster where I had Akane's narration disabled for the entire game. It's honestly pretty sad that the more accessible version of the game is flawed in this way. VLR keeps on going strong by redoing the whole You Are Zero twist, but in a different way. At first it may strike you as kinda odd that Sigma has no voice acting, but you get used to it. It's only later that you realise it's because if you heard him speak, you'd recognise him as Zero after seeing the hologram message left by his other consciousness. I like how this twist really plays with your natural assumptions. You never see Sigma's face at all outside of the flashbacks to his kidnapping, but you have no reason to assume that it's different now. It's an interesting twist because it just wouldn't work at all if the game followed any other character's perspective. Granted, you do definitely need to suspend your disbelief for this twist to work. Like, yeah, Sigma can't see himself at all, but does he really never just, touch his face at any point and think, hey, what the hell is up with my eye? Similarly, nobody comments at all on his bionic eye, which kinda seems like the first thing you'd notice about him. But I can ignore that stuff. The interesting use of narrative perspective and the great ending of VLR make it really easy to look past things like that. Finally, there's the twist in Zero Time Dilemma. This one is a little more controversial. A lot of people aren't fans of Delta's reveal. They feel like his existence came out of nowhere and was very unsatisfying. But I think all the little hints about his existence were pretty cool. So I'm going to have to provide a little more context for this twist. Basically, unlike the other 2 games, Zero Time Dilemma separates the 9 characters into 3 teams. C-Team, D-Team and Q-Team, named after their leaders Carlos, Diana and Q, which are the characters you play as. Q-Team is most relevant to the Delta twist. I was convinced they wouldn't be able to do the twist this time around with 3 different player characters, and yet they still pulled it off. So Q is the outlier among the other 9 characters. Unlike the other 8, he doesn't know any of them and they don't know him, and with the helmet he wears, his identity is a complete mystery. Much later on you find out that Q is not actually his name. His name is Sean and he's a robot. You ever notice how nobody ever actually calls him Q? Q-Team knew his real name the whole time, you just never hear it until later, probably because the main person he interacts with for most of the game is Eric, who spends all of his time referring to him like this.
Damn, Brat. Stop bullshitting me.
So then, who is Q? The other teams aren't even aware of Sean's existence, and yet they'll sometimes refer to a person named Q. Well, as you'd expect, he's the leader of Q Team, but unlike the other leaders, Q can't lead at all. Q is an old man in a wheelchair who is both deaf and blind. He was a part of the test facility experiment in order to observe how the other residents would handle difficult situations, such as caring for someone with disabilities. In reality, Q never had any of these disabilities. He was really Delta, the mastermind behind the decision game. Delta watched the game unfold using his special glasses, which allow him to monitor camera footage inside the facility. Delta is the character whose perspective we see the game unfold from, whether it's watching Q Team directly or watching the other two teams through cameras. Like other main characters, Delta is an Esper, but his ability is different. He possesses the ability to mind hack instead of shift, allowing him to read thoughts as well as briefly take control of others. When you make a choice that's uncharacteristic, the team leaders will say they felt as if something took control of them in the moment, which you later find out was Delta's influence. Essentially, the player is seeing things unfold from Delta's perspective and mind-hacking the characters when they make choices. I was seriously impressed that they managed to do the same twist for the third time and still make it surprising, especially since I was convinced that it just wouldn't be possible in Zero Time Dilemma. Where people start to take issue with this twist is the fact that he's not shown at all prior to this reveal. Even in Q-Team scenes, he's never on screen, and as such, people feel like he comes out of absolutely nowhere. But I don't know, I kind of like it. When you actually look into it, you see there are actually a lot of little things that point towards Delta's existence, whether they're lines of dialogue or little details like the shadow cast by his wheelchair, which is just off screen, or how you'll hear a fourth person hitting the floor whenever Q-Team get knocked out.
Pleasant dreams.
Or how you hear Delta screaming alongside the rest of Q-Team if they get killed in the acid showers. Yeah, acid showers, what a charming game. You definitely wouldn't notice these things the first time around, but there are also more blatant hints about his existence, so I really do feel like it's a bit reductive to say the reveal came completely out of nowhere. I really like the experimental nature of these twists. They're surprising on a basic level, but at the same time, because of the unorthodox methods they use, they're also surprising on a meta level. The twists all work by subverting the natural assumptions the player would have about perspective as a narrative device after experiencing many other stories. In 999, it's surprising to see that the story has been unfolding through two perspectives simultaneously. In VLR, the truth about the story is hidden just out of view because you see things from Sigma's perspective. And in ZTD, it subverts the expectation that the perspective the player sees things from is simply just a non-diegetic third-person perspective. I really enjoy the way that Uchikoshi layers twists like this. When they're surprising on a level besides just the basic information revealed, it makes them so much more impactful and turns them into the kinds of moments that really define the stories. It's also cool to see that he's still experimenting with ways to make twists impactful to this day. I won't spoil what it is, but the Somnium Files Nirvana initiative has a twist later on that was so huge I had to take like an hour-long break from the game just to process it. Of course, twists don't really matter if the basic contents of a story aren't interesting, but that's not a concern with Zero Escape. Honestly, I tend to not really enjoy stories where characters take a backseat. I think it's just kind of hard to really anchor myself in a story without any perspectives I care about, but Zero Escape actually creates a very engaging story, despite its characters not being the most interesting. Even before the series escalated into a story about an apocalyptic virus, it had always been focused on these large macro-level ideas, the kinds of ideas posited in the thought experiments and theories the games frequently reference. The decision to pair these high concepts with a mystery narrative was an inspired choice. When these concepts are introduced to the player in the context of it being a mystery story, the player naturally becomes curious about what these ideas might mean for the story and how they might coalesce at the end, getting them to engage with these ideas in their mind. Of course, even outside of the sci-fi concept, on a fundamental level, a mystery narrative gets the player interested in seeing how things unfold, and especially enhances the experience when it comes to twists. The main drive for the audience with mystery stories is to figure out the truth, and so that makes the twists an exciting prospect. The moment when all is revealed is the moment you've awaited for the entire game, so that only makes the twists even more memorable. Of course, the series also knows when to show some restraint and not reveal too much. By the end of each game, there are still always some aspects that remain a mystery. It's a fine line to walk between revealing too much and leaving too much unknown, but I'd say the trilogy walks it pretty perfectly, which not only makes for an intriguing story, but also an engaging horror experience. I wouldn't really describe Zero Escape as a full-on horror series, but I think that's to its advantage. Honestly, I'm not really a huge horror fan at all. I'm just kinda indifferent to the genre, yet for whatever reason I find myself attracted to stories that aren't full-on horror but include horror elements or motifs, which is how I'd describe Zero Escape. I suppose if I had to guess why that might be, I think it's because when horror isn't the explicit focus but can instead show up in small ways, it tends to stick out to me more out of contrast. Whereas explicit horror lacks that contrast since almost everything exists to provoke feelings of unease or fear in those kinds of stories. None of the games ever really straight up frightened me, but their more uncomfortable and unpleasant aspects really stuck with me after finishing them, which I find to be a more engaging form of horror than a story that scares you in the moment but doesn't have enough real substance to it to stick with you after the fact. The premise of the series alone is enough to make it sound like a horror story. Comparisons to stuff like Saw are pretty much inevitable, not to mention death game stories are pretty common in Japanese media. While I do think Zero Escape has a little more humour and levity compared to a typical horror story, it does still take the danger of the scenario seriously enough. 999 pretty much immediately conveys that these games aren't messing around with Kubota's death in the early game.
Oh my god!
Good God. Whoa, that's pretty bad. He blew up.
Oh, that can't be real, Pooh. Oh.
I apologise for that, and now please kindly subscribe so that I can start making money. The games also use some tried and true devices for horror, like effective use of tension to build up anticipation for when the bad stuff happens. Honestly, I feel like the degree of success when it comes to use of tension across the series is rather mixed. 999 reserves most character deaths for late in each story route, delaying the moment when everything starts going wrong, giving the game a lot of time to build up anticipation and dread. VLR and ZTD do the opposite and have a little too much death, diminishing the impact greatly, especially in VLR. With so many different story routes, there are a lot of routes that share events, and that includes character deaths, and when you see the same thing multiple times, it really loses all of its shock value. It goes from, oh god, Alice is dead, to, oh hey, Alice is dead again. For this reason, I'd say that 999 is definitely the best at capturing the inherent horror of its scenario, whereas the other two are a little more focused on telling their winding narratives. And this varying success also extends to the narrative execution of their antagonists. In each game, one of the people kidnapped by Zero is actually looking to murder the other characters for different reasons. They act as the danger variable required for characters to access the morphogenetic field. Ace from 999 is a pretty simple antagonist, yet his role in the story is very effective. He not only ties into the backstory, being the person who devised the original Nonary game, but he also effectively establishes a very sinister tone as he's willing to murder anyone to keep his secrets, even his past accomplices. In all three bad endings where he claims victims, he's never explicitly revealed to be the killer, and this keeps you unsure of who to trust, tapping into a very human kind of horror. In a dangerous situation like the Nonary game, people's selfish instincts can really kick in and lead to them doing unspeakable things for their own sake. And yet you can never be sure of any of that, since they can hide those intentions behind good manners and a smile, just as Ace does. Dio and Mira in VLR and ZTD respectively just don't have that unknown factor to them. It really doesn't take long to figure out they're not exactly looking out for anyone other than themselves, and so they're not really all that intimidating. I mean, Dio at least means business. He's willing to blow up the entire facility to stop the Nonary game, and stopping his schemes takes a lot of effort. Whereas Mira just feels like she's dead for most of the late game scenes. Well, at least she's keeping Fire company. Both of these characters mainly just feel like plot devices rather than sources of horror. 999 excels at utilising the fear of the unknown, not just with the delayed reveal of Ace's intentions, but also the setting. The setting is a mysterious one, a building that perfectly recreates the gigantic, sister ship of the Titanic. Even after you figure out the game's main mysteries, you never quite know what's up with the gigantic. Like, why does it have a torture room and prison cells? In the story of Zero Escape, it was bought by a Titanic survivor named Dashiell Gourdain, who became obsessed with everything surrounding the infamous ship. And it's heavily implied that he was into some sinister stuff. The most mysterious part of the ship is definitely the church, which is decorated with bizarre occult symbols that aren't explained at all in 999. Even in VLR, where you find out that those symbols are related to Free the Soul, you still don't know much about the organisation, and this continues in ZTD, even when you finally see its enigmatic founder, Delta. What really stands out to me is this scene where Delta offers to let Akane attend one of their ceremonies just before the reactors are detonated, where he says she'll be able to witness their god. What Delta means by this is a complete mystery. Akane does attend the ceremony, but you never see any of it. I appreciate the restraint shown here. There's always a risk when following up a mystery narrative that you can over-explain things and completely kill the mystery of the original story. But they avoided that by creating a new mystery in its place, after revealing what the deal actually is with the church in 999. Based on everything I've said so far, it may seem like the other two games aren't really as effective in regards to horror, but I feel like their horror exists more so in the unsettling ideas they put forth. VLR really taps into the fear of being lost, primarily in its ending. Being unable to return to your normal life, your home and your loved ones is a terrifying thought to me. But at least it's not technically impossible to return one day. Well, VLR shreds even that small glimmer of hope. Alice and Clover haven't just woken up in an unfamiliar place, they're in a different time entirely. Waking up 45 years in the future is already a freaky idea, but to make things even worse, an apocalypse has occurred while they were frozen. With 75% of humanity dead, it's not hard to imagine that Clover's brother, Light, could be dead too. And after you see how much they meant to each other in 999, the thought of them being separated like this is just... man. After their roles in the Nonary game are fulfilled, they're just left there while Sigma and Phi get to go back to the past. Now stranded in a completely unfamiliar world where their loved ones are all likely dead. I don't think I need to really explain why that's such a horrifying thought. It definitely didn't help that I finished the game shortly before New Year's Eve, which is when the Radical 6 outbreak happens. That, combined with my sometimes overactive imagination, made trying to sleep that night very fun. Lastly, Zero Time Dilemma. The animations in this get a lot of criticism for being super stiff, and yeah, I can't really argue with that. They're a far cry from how much more polished the team's later 3D games are. But I feel like there are times when this one genuinely managed to get to me, like those acid showers I mentioned earlier. All three teams can die in these, but what really got to me is when it happens to Q Team. Obviously, Sean is actually a robot, but you aren't aware of that earlier on, so to your knowledge, a child is getting melted to death by corrosive acid, which is just yikes. Especially while it's happening and you can hear everyone screaming in agony, as you can only imagine what it must look like off screen. Afterwards, you get to see the remains of everyone, and all that's left are these fleshy stains, and it's just ugh. The style of presentation in ZTD is definitely a bit off, but this is an example of a time where it works really effectively. I'm not normally sensitive to, like, gore and stuff, but oh man. Still, that's not really the main thing with Zero Time Dilemma that I found unnerving. As I alluded to earlier, much like VLR, it's to do with one of the ideas put forth, specifically regarding shifting and multiple timelines. VLR already established shifting as a concept, but ZTD really explored the darker side of it. Shifting transports a person's consciousness into their body in another timeline. Sigma describes his experiences with unknowingly shifting as a child, and the idea of it just sounds like it creates a disturbingly lonely existence. In situations where he was in danger, this would cause him to shift instinctively, and he'd then end up in another timeline. Maybe everything is essentially the same in this new timeline he finds himself in, but can he really say he knows anyone? Are his parents in this world really the ones who raised him? What if he ends up unwillingly shifting again? Can he ever truly connect to anyone like this if it's all effectively undone when he moves to a new timeline? You may also be wondering what happens to the person's consciousness that gets replaced. What occurs is a direct swap. The consciousness from the timeline you're shifting to will go into your body in the timeline you left. When you then consider that a person usually shifts when they're in life-threatening danger, yeah, in a lot of cases you'll be killing another version of yourself if you decide to shift. They don't really touch upon it, but the versions of the characters you follow in the true ending timeline could theoretically get killed at any moment by other versions of themselves shifting in a dangerous situation. Almost every time you see shifting occur in the series, a character ends up killing one of their other selves or dooming them to a horrible fate. And this is something that Delta has the characters confront. The final decision you have to make in the game is whether or not everyone should shift to a timeline where they were all safely released from the shelter without needing to play the decision game. Their selves who were released just innocently won a coin flip at the beginning of the game. So is it right to rob them of that? The true horror of shifting is how it inevitably gets blood on your hands, even if you have no murderous intent at all. Like Carlos. Carlos became a firefighter to help people, and yet that comes at the cost of killing his other selves many times in the line of duty. Which becomes especially upsetting when you consider all the timelines that would create where his sister would have to try and cope with his death after her parents already passed away. All of these things make shifting seem much more like a horrific curse than a special power, especially since the characters who can usually shift get unwillingly brought into the schemes of characters like Akane and Delta. And given the magnitude of the events that those two seek to manipulate, getting dragged into their plans is almost guaranteed to uproot your entire life. I mean, just look at Sigma. He was just a normal student who got dragged into creating a plan to save the world, all according to Akane's designs. His happiness was forcibly sacrificed by someone else, all for a supposed greater good. This brings me to the themes of morality, which I found to be the most interesting aspect of the series. This wasn't really something explored in a lot of detail in 999, but Akane's plan definitely wasn't something I'd describe as ethical. As all the bad endings show, it's hardly foolproof and can go wrong in multiple different ways. She puts the lives of others at risk so that she can be saved. Virtue's Last Reward is where this theme really started to get a lot of focus. The Ambidex game is a very interesting exploration of this theme. Being based on the prisoner's dilemma, a round of the AB game sees two sides choose either ally or betray. If both sides choose ally, they both gain 2 bracelet points, or BP for short. If one side betrays and the other allies, the one who betrays gets 3 BP while the one who allies loses 2. If both sides betray each other, they neither gain or lose any BP. Reaching 9 BP allows someone to escape the game, while reaching 0 will result in death. The thing I find most interesting about the AB game is how, initially, it seems kinda like a simple moral decision. You can never be sure if your opponent will ally or betray, so is it right to put yourself at risk by trusting them, or should you betray them to protect yourself? If you do betray them, does that make you a bad person if they chose ally? When your opponent doesn't know if they can trust you, does it make them a bad person for choosing betray? These are the sorts of things you'll be considering when playing the AB game earlier on, but across all the different routes, you'll play the AB game a lot, and things start to change. The player is driven by the pursuit of truth in order to bring about the best possible outcome for the story, and to do that you're inevitably going to have to betray quite a few people along the line to see certain plot-critical timelines. At first you're choosing ally or betray, either putting yourself at risk to help everyone gain BP, or protecting yourself, even if it's potentially at the expense of someone else. Later on, ally or betray just becomes a simple choice of A or B. The morality of the decision no longer a consideration. You've betrayed enough people to begin feeling unfazed by it all, and it becomes a simple choice of either story branch A or branch B, all in pursuit of the truth. Although that doesn't mean Sigma doesn't still feel bad about his choices.
Sigma, why did you and Vi do that?
It just hurts so much.
Normally I'd criticise choices that don't really mean much to the player, but VLR utilises it in an interesting way, appearing to initially present simple, self-contained moral choices, but then revealing later on that the question of morality actually exists on a much larger scale than any of the individual choices you make. Your ultimate goal in exploring all of the flowchart is to reach the true ending where everyone can survive, but that's only one ending of 20, and across those other 19 endings you do quite a fair amount of betraying. So is it right to doom certain characters in 19 other routes just for the sake of one ending where everything actually goes right? Going back to Akane's nonary game in 999, was she not doing the same thing? Using the AB game as a metaphor, her actions in 999 could be likened to choosing betray, as she endangered others, including her loved ones like Junpei and her own brother, all for the sake of a timeline where she can be saved. I mean, sure, she's also at risk of dying during the nonary game, but that makes no difference. She'd die anyway if she didn't create the nonary game, since her death in the past wouldn't be prevented, so she stands to lose nothing by putting herself at risk. By possessing the ability to choose ally or betray, the player is essentially put in the same position as Akane. What's scariest about this is that Akane's moral compass is definitely questionable at best, and at worst it is downright awful. It doesn't surprise me at all that a lot of fans of the series view Akane as straight up evil. Akane is unwavering in her commitment to doing what she believes is right. While preventing Radical 6 is a noble goal on paper, to do so she's unafraid to commit acts of extreme cruelty, which is best showcased by VLR. The Nonary game Amberdex edition is absolutely terrible. Not only are people put through all the suffering caused by the AB game, but it gets way worse in the ending. There's the aforementioned fate of Alice and Clover, being left behind in 2074 while Sigma and Vi essentially get drafted into the mission to stop the virus without much say in things, which puts them in harm's way during Zero Time Dilemma. The absolute worst thing is that Quark is forced to play it. She's endangering a child for the sake of her plans. All of this isn't to say that Sigma is blameless either. During his time developing the game, he created his son Kyle via cloning and created Luna, a robotic copy of Diana, after she passed away. Though unlike Diana, he saw Luna more as a daughter. They may not have been conventional family, but they were family nonetheless, yet Sigma ends up forcing them to play the Nonary game where they can both meet terrible fates. It gets even worse when Akane reveals why everyone was chosen to play the game. Clover and Junpei were chosen because of their abilities as espers, which would strengthen Sigma and Vi's ability to shift. Alice was chosen for her mathematical ability, which would help the game progress smoothly, and similarly, Kyle and Luna were also there to make sure the game goes as intended. Which begs the question of whether Sigma even created them out of love, or if it was merely to use them for the sake of the game. As I touched upon briefly earlier, Dio was left to infiltrate the facility freely so he could act as a danger variable. And that just leaves Quark. You want to know why Quark was chosen? The only reason Quark is a part of the game is because as Junpei's adoptive grandson, he didn't want to leave Junpei's side when he went to the moon. And so they were both forced to play the game after being knocked out on the moon. He was even used as leverage to make Junpei stay quiet about the pandemic and the fact that they were on the moon. I mentioned earlier that Zero Escape doesn't really place too much focus on its characters, and for the most part they're not terribly interesting. I didn't really care for a lot of characters in VLR, for example. But at the same time, I feel like VLR is the game where Junpei became a super interesting character, by far the most interesting character in the series to me. As the protagonist of 999, Junpei was kind of a blank slate, but by making him a character independent of the player in VLR, they were able to flesh him out massively. Junpei represents the opposite of Akane's views, believing that her plan is wrong. Though it does raise the question of why he willingly came to the moon, which there's a bit of context behind. After the events of 999, Akane went on the run, and Junpei, harbouring romantic feelings for her, went searching for her. They reunited on the day Radical 6 was released, during Zero Time Dilemma, but in the timeline that leads to VLR, she ends up injecting him with a memory loss drug and carrying out her plan on her own, preparing to create the Nonary game on the moon with Sigma. Junpei awakens in a world ruined by Radical 6, and just a few months later, the world was burned by the detonation of the Annihilation reactors. He spent his days salvaging machinery from abandoned buildings for a living in the post-apocalyptic society, though he never gave up his search for Akane, even if it seemed pointless. And he ended up dedicating his life to the search until he grew old. Things changed one day when he found Quark as a baby. He took him in and found new purpose caring for him. Still, his love for Akane never truly left him, and so when he received a message saying he could see Akane if he just came to the moon, he didn't hesitate. The message was from Sigma, and by following it, Junpei and Quark walked right into a trap. It's really not hard to see why Junpei is so unhappy with Akane during the ending. The way she manipulated his feelings for her and used him for his abilities as an Esper could only be described as exploitation. Though Junpei isn't exactly concerned about himself, he's much angrier about how Quark was endangered. Bringing Quark was definitely a mistake on his part, but that doesn't change the fact that he wasn't needed for any purpose besides silencing Junpei. He may have been the one who brought Quark, but Akane and Sigma are the ones who chose to endanger him. When they make good on their promise, and Junpei finally gets to meet Akane again for the first time in almost 50 years, it's not a happy reunion at all. In fact, she hardly acknowledges him any more than any of the other characters, and completely fails to even provide him with any sort of apology for the suffering she'd put him and Quark through. After all that, any love he held for her is gone. She's dead to him, and he simply gets ready to head back to Earth with Quark and live out the rest of his days without even saying goodbye to her. Can you really blame him? He's seen just how far she'll go in doing what's supposedly right, and it sickens him. At this point, his love and care is better spent on his grandson, and that's where his disdain for Akane's plan comes from. He recognises that the pandemic and resulting apocalypse was a horrific tragedy, and yet people rebuilt. Humanity pulled itself back against all odds, and although it could hardly be called perfect, people were able to find their happiness. In his case, that happiness was Quark, and by preventing the release of Radical 6, it would stop Junpei from ever meeting Quark, which he finds completely unacceptable.
Being human is about fighting, even when it seems hopeless, and finding happiness, even in a world that hates it. Are you saying that's worthless? If you're saying rewriting the past will erase all these other timelines, then whatever God wrote those rules can Look, I'm just not going to accept that, alright? You get it?
He describes the whole thing with an analogy about a group of bikers. They can either go northwest or northeast at a junction. Going northwest results in them getting into an accident where many of them are killed. But further down the line, the remaining bikers find happiness in the form of romantic partners and such. And so, although going northeast will prevent the accident from ever occurring, is it right to erase the happiness the survivors found in order to save the others? While the timelines where Junpei meets Quark aren't erased when Radical 6 is stopped, the damage is already done by Akane and Sigma, since by making them participate in the Nonary game, they create multiple timelines where Junpei dies, leaving Quark behind, or where both of them end up dying. Perhaps the saddest part about it is that in the true ending of Zero Time Dilemma, Junpei will never meet Quark. Instead, he ends up getting engaged to Akane, which honestly feels a little sickening after seeing what happens in VLR. And it's not as if Junpei even knows. He has no idea about the suffering Akane put him through in the VLR timeline. Well, she knows everything, but happily goes along with the engagement anyway. I imagine VLR Junpei would be pretty disgusted if he saw it. His younger self hasn't seen the much uglier side of Akane, which was enough to make him lose faith in her entirely. She's no longer the person he knew, but beyond that, he believes that she may not even be human anymore, like at some point Akane died and something else took her place. VLR touches upon the concept of higher intellects that can comprehend the actions of simpler life, using termites as an example. An individual termite is unaware of it, but their actions contribute to their perfectly constructed nests, and the perfect construction can only be appreciated by a higher intellect. In this case, humans. However, humans also find themselves in the same position as the termites, unable to comprehend the purpose of their own collective actions. A purpose that may only be understood by an intelligence that surpasses humanity. Akane's ability to shift positions her as one of these intellects. Although there are many other shifters in the series, none are as aware of important events as her. They mainly just use their abilities instinctively to protect themselves, whereas she utilises her abilities to devise these grand schemes to change the course of history. Delta falls into the same category. He may not be a shifter, but his ability to read the thoughts of shifters from other timelines gives him a similar level of awareness to Akane. Both of them have theoretically seen an unknowable amount of timelines. They've seen how time plays out on the largest scale possible, making them the higher intellects described by Sigma, able to understand the actions of humanity and what purpose they fulfill. In Akane's case, she may have even lived for a potentially infinite amount of time prior to VLR, as shifting essentially makes a person immortal. At that point, Junpei's pretty much right. Can she really be called a human anymore? Interestingly enough, for all I've been saying about how far Akane takes things, she does clearly still possess some humanity. She treats Junpei pretty terribly in the VLR timeline, but her love for him still appears genuine. The password for her system ID shows pretty clearly that he never really left her thoughts, even after she spent many years apart from him. Zero Time Dilemma is where her feelings for Junpei manifest even more strongly. Her goal is to stop the virus, but in any timelines where Junpei is killed, she'll pretty much completely lose it and start seeking blind revenge above everything else, even if it's detrimental to her larger plan. For all her almost godlike powers, at her core is still a human psyche with flaws and desires that can be pushed over the edge. The same can hardly be said about Delta. Delta is an incredibly difficult character to pin down since he's so shrouded in mystery, but the concrete details about him paint a different picture compared to Akane. Although similar in how they're both master manipulators changing the course of history, Delta seems completely unshakable in his goals in a way that not even Akane is. Not once does he ever deviate from his plans because of some unforeseen circumstances like Akane does, even when his own life is threatened. In fact, that's something he accounts for. To him, his death in the decision game is just one of the many outcomes he's prepared for. Keep in mind, he can't shift, so when he dies, that's it for him. That's how dedicated he is to ensuring his plans succeed. Delta also appears to lack a conscience. Not even Akane would go as far as to kill 75% of humanity just to have a chance of preventing its complete extinction. The games they create further illustrate the differences between them. The two Nonary games are designed with the intention that everyone will survive, in one timeline at least. In fact, the first one in 999 is actually rather safe. The main threat is Ace rather than any aspect of the game itself. In contrast, the decision game's rules only allow for a maximum of 3 survivors. Even in the true ending, where all 9 players survive, they do so by sacrificing their other selves who were safely released. After all that, Delta rather confidently asserts that the police can't do a thing to him, since no one technically died in that timeline and he emptied out the facility of all evidence that he committed any crimes. So why exactly was the decision game so brutal? In Delta's own words, it was out of his own simple curiosity about human decision making in life or death situations. Not even D-Team, whose members are all family to him, are spared from his deadly curiosity. If you were to describe Akane and Delta as a pair of gods, I'd say that Akane is a well-meaning but rather extreme utilitarian deity, seeking to help as many people as possible, but with no reservations about harming people if it will contribute to what she sees as the greater good. Delta, on the other hand, appears to be a chaotic god, motivated solely by curiosity with no regard for morals. My personal interpretation is that even his mission to prevent global nuclear war is something he's only undertaking to satisfy his curiosity, simply to see if he's capable of drastically altering the future. The question becomes whether or not characters like Akane and Delta are justified in their actions, or whether we can even be the judge of that. As Espers, their minds quite literally exist in the 4th dimension, and as regular humans, can we even begin to comprehend beings that exist on a higher plane like that? We can try to apply our own ideas about morality, but they're limited by the subjective nature of morality as a concept. Playing the AB game does actually give the player a window into Akane's mindset. And as cruel as it seems, without betraying people across all the different timelines of VLR, you wouldn't reach the true ending where everyone lives. The true ending route even specifically requires you to betray people. In the end, there's no real conclusive answer to any of these questions. Do the ends justify the means with Akane and Delta's plans? Or is Junpei right about not erasing the happiness of the survivors? People will come to different answers about these questions, and I think that's great. When everything in a story is wrapped up neatly, it just loses staying power. If things are left open, then that allows for discussion and debate, which helps keep a community alive, even a smaller, more niche one like Zero Escape's community. The morality discussion doesn't quite end there, though. My interpretation of things goes a bit further. So, about all those bootstrap paradoxes that are all over the series, they all form these closed loops where it's impossible to determine where things even start and end. A lot of people really aren't fond of them as they see them as rather weak writing. But for me, I feel like they prompted me to ask some really interesting questions about the nature of time itself in this series. And the answers I came to resulted in the following interpretation. This might be kind of rambly and not make all that much sense, but I'll try my best to explain. If time has no beginning or end, does a linear flow of time even exist? With how the past and future interact in Zero Escape, it appears as if they exist simultaneously. In other words, theoretically every single moment in time exists at once. With that in mind, is the concept of past, present and future even real? That may be how we understand time, but that's just our limited human perspective. If that is the case, then I feel like shifters would be the only people who can truly experience the passage of time. If time is already determined and the future already exists, then the linear flow us normal humans perceive could simply be an illusion. Whereas shifters are able to see that all time periods and timelines exist simultaneously and move through time freely of their own will. At the same time though, just because they can perceive the true nature of time may not mean they're free of its constraints. Many timelines in Zero Escape specifically exist because of the actions of shifters. Perhaps those timelines are created in the moment a shifter performs that action, but if time is already fixed, then every timeline would theoretically already exist, which would mean shifters are simply playing into it under the illusion of freedom. If that is the case, then whatever your stance is on characters like Akane and Delta, could they even be considered good or evil if they're not actually making these choices and their actions are instead simply predetermined? They would simply just be like the termites, cogs in a machine, constructing the grand creation of time itself. A creation beyond their comprehension that could only be understood by intellect that surpasses even espers like themselves. Should I even be pondering such huge questions like this, or should I simply go back to watching Callum's Corner rant videos?
I'm wanking off in front of my family!
Gotta love that guy. Like the thought experiments Uchikoshi was clearly inspired by, there are no clear answers to any of these questions, and I think that's an indication that he achieved what he was going for. Zero Escape's themes essentially form their own thought experiment. This ambiguous open-endedness defines the ending of the series. Aside from a few extra files that detail some character interactions after the credits, what happens after the ending of Zero Time Dilemma is completely unknown, and I feel like that was by design. Uchikoshi has specifically said that he likes seeing different fan interpretations and doesn't want the mysteries of the game to just have a single definitive answer that crushes speculation. I like to see Delta in the final scene almost like an analogue for Uchikoshi himself. Delta is a character who seems far more aware of everything going on within the series than anyone else, and yet all he really offers is some rather vague insight that leaves a lot up to the imagination. Just like Delta, Uchikoshi is intimately familiar with the inner workings of the series as its director, and keeps his cards close to his chest regarding the truth of its biggest mysteries. So, as for that final decision, does Carlos shoot Delta or not? Both. Given the nature of timelines in Zero Escape, it's guaranteed that Carlos made both possible decisions across different timelines. What does that actually mean for the story, though? Maybe you believe everything Delta said and take the ending at face value, where Carlos doesn't kill him and everyone begins working with him to find and stop the religious terrorist. Maybe you instead don't trust a word Delta says. I could hardly blame you. And so your interpretation is that Delta was simply lying about the religious terrorist, or maybe that he was actually the religious terrorist this whole time, and by shooting him, Carlos prevents the extinction of humanity and everyone finally lives in peace, free of all the horrors associated with shifting. Maybe you could even choose to believe that Carlos just shoots everyone, for some reason. I don't know why you choose to believe that of all things, but you can. The final decision is more than just the choice of whether or not Carlos shoots Delta, it's also whether or not the player shoots Uchikoshi. Okay, you don't literally shoot him, but you get what I mean. By metaphorically shooting him, you've caused the death of the author, at which point the only meaning of the story left is whatever you personally see in it. I understand why lots of people wouldn't enjoy a character like Delta. His introduction is very sudden and he hardly explains himself at all. But I personally didn't hate him since I feel like his enigmatic nature led to me reaching this interpretation of him which I'm really satisfied with. And even if you aren't a fan of my interpretation, you can just totally disregard it. In the end, the outcome and truth of this series is all in the hands of the individual. In a way, all stories are really. Even if the authorial intent is conveyed much more clearly than in something like Zero Escape and has a much less ambiguous ending, we can find meaning in little things the creator may have never even considered. Perhaps, for example, a small bit of dialogue can resonate with you on a personal level, even if others just pass it by without thinking about it and the creator didn't mean anything too deeply when writing it. And I think that's pretty awesome. It means everyone has something unique they can bring to the table, even when they're all discussing the same thing. So, I guess I like sci-fi now. I mean, I probably already did, seeing how I listed off all those other sci-fi games I enjoyed at the start of the video. But I think playing Zero Escape has made me actually realise it. The series is a pretty huge love letter to the genre, as is apparent with how much it pays homage to other sci-fi stories and concepts. I think I always had this misconception that sci-fi is largely limited to stories set in outer space, which isn't really a setting I enjoy too much. But now I see how versatile it can be. The Uchikoshi games I've played use the genre in tandem with both death game stories and detective fiction, not to mention they've always had this engaging undercurrent of horror going on. And other games I've played, like the Digital Devil Saga duology, combine sci-fi with Hindu spirituality to create something really unique. I now see sci-fi less as a genre, and more like a style of theming that can be applied to many different genres and settings, with the primary goal of getting you to think about more complex theoretical concepts. And I have Zero Escape to thank for finally getting me to appreciate it more. I wouldn't say Zero Escape is perfect by any means. I feel like all three games are kind of flawed in different ways, but the bigger picture created by all three games in harmony more than makes up for any areas that are kind of lacking in my eyes. Of course, I'll now be looking forward to future works by the development team. Whether that's a third entry in the Eye of the Somnium Files series or something entirely new. It's always nice finding new creators you enjoy, whose works you can look forward to experiencing. As for the future of Zero Escape, Uchikoshi has said he's open to creating another entry if the fans want it, but honestly I'm fine with just leaving it as is. Another entry would probably just interfere with the intentional open-endedness of the ending. As such, I'm happy to just let sleeping dogs lie. So, I like sci-fi more now. What's another genre I can get more into thanks to a specific game? Ooh, I know! Fantasy!
To put it another way, this is a fantasy.
Look, I really meant it when I called this an obsession. Like, I might have a problem here.
Sigma, what's wrong with your hand? There's something white on it.
Ah, semen.